I'll share my screen. Right. Okay. Okay. Where we ended on Tuesday is we started talking about this general model of helping. And what I encourage you to do is start practicing doing a complete exploration of a problem and then developing insight with the person and then developing an action plan based on your experiences and their experiences with going through this process. Okay. And what this process requires, and we kind of talked about this with humanistic theory, is it requires what we call a client-centered focus theory or approach. Okay, and what this centered focus theory approach means is that we're guided by internal factors, not external factors. And this is something that sometimes it's difficult for a therapist, especially when you're working with trauma, you're working with inmate populations with addiction problems or mental health problems, to resist doing. Okay, and let me kind of explain. In the beginning of treatment, the actual facts of a person's situation are not really what matters. What matters is the internal framework with how that client has structured the problem. Okay. And so, in this, we need to realize that what the client is relaying to us is their lived experience, even though it may sound like they're not telling the complete truth, they're not telling really what's going on. What we have to make sure we do in the beginning phases of therapy and group work is take people's internal frameworks as more valid than what probably happened in reality. Now, I do need to stop here because usually I get a question, well, what if I'm working with a client population and they just want to manipulate and get their way out of doing treatment, blah, blah, blah. And this is where I say is that if you have set up the therapeutic relationship correctly and you've put in the work to establish that relationship with the client, that reduces the probability that they're just going to say something in order to get out of the treatment process. So yes, working with certain client populations, will they want to, in the initial beginning, tell you whatever they think you want to hear, or make them look more favorable than maybe what they should? Absolutely. But that's why we start with the establishment of a therapeutic alliance with our clients. We just don't instantly go into, well, what are you here for? Well, you do, but what drill into what is it that they expect and all those kinds of things. We need to establish that relationship first. And then we get into understanding the internal factors. Now, does that reduce the potential that a client will want to present themselves more favorably than maybe what they should? Sure. It doesn't 100% guarantee that you'll get, their actual lived experience, but it at least increases that chance, and increases the chance that you will get their true lived internal experiences. The other issue that really is very harmful to the therapeutic relationship is, I call it being a social voyeur. Okay. Especially with a lot of novice therapists, they turn into, instead of being a therapist, to trying to be a detective. And they start to ask questions that about the situation that may absolutely have no bearing whatsoever on the therapeutic relationship and the therapy itself. Okay. An example of this is that when in the initial phases of therapy, we want to focus on the here and now. How are our clients experiencing the world here and now? How are they experiencing their symptoms? Understanding them from the point of where they're living at this moment. But unfortunately, it gets tempting for some, especially novice counselors, to try and dig into the dirty meat of maybe they were molested as a child and you want to know who, how, when, why, or maybe they were in a gang situation and you want to know, well, who was that gang? What was that like? What was it? And it becomes more focused on you and your curiosity than on the actual therapeutic benefit for the client. Okay. So when you find yourself wanting to know the details, it's time to step back and go, wait a minute, what value does this have in the therapeutic relationship? Most of the time you will say no, it has none, and you'll change your direction of questioning. Okay. Because what we want is their lived experience and what they experienced. And sometimes we can actually do more harm by digging into things we feel we need to know instead of what needs to be said in the situation. So be careful of that with especially these initial phases of treatment. Okay. This centered approach suggests that we have an innate blueprint or a set of potentialities that can be developed. Okay. If you remember when we talked about the humanistic approach, it focuses on the positive aspect of an individual. Okay. And what this idea suggests is that clients do have that ability, that potential to overcome a problem. And our job really is to help them understand their own potential, their own ability to create change. Now, yes, maybe we probably need to do some psychoeducational stuff and put in some coping skills and all of those kinds of things. Definitely. But if your client doesn't realize that they have that innate ability to change and to become something potentially better, then that doesn't matter. And again, this is why in the beginning phases of building your therapeutic alliance, what you're looking for is, yes, you want to see what their triggers are, their symptoms are, but you also want to dig into what is it, why is it that they're there with you? Obviously, there's some reason why they're there. They see some problem in the situation. Now, albeit sometimes this isn't, it's not always easy to get. So if you get into in situations such as court ordered treatments, those kinds of things, this may be harder to pinpoint because a lot of times these individuals are in denial that they have a problem, or they project that they're there because, again, the judge or the whoever has just put them there and they don't see that ability or that need for change. So it does get a little bit harder dependent upon the population you work with. But it is something that we all should accept, that everybody has the potential for change. Okay. So that's number 2 in the centered focused area. The other thing that we try to accept, or we should accept, I shouldn't say try, is that we are all motivated to become self-actualized. We're all motivated to know ourselves completely, and making sure we access this and work on those, again, going back to those needs that allow a person to actually see and be able to understand themselves fully. So part of the group process and the treatment process is, of course, is helping them work on the biological safety, relationship, and emotional needs or psychological needs, so that they can get to that point where they start to truly understand themselves as a complete human being. Okay. And again, we talked about this. All issues arise through the congruency between real and imagined selves, and helping individuals accept who they are completely, so that they can change is kind of what we want to do in this beginning phases of a treatment process. So if I were to summarize this slide, is one, we believe that people have the potentiality for change, and that they do truly want to know themselves completely and have this sense that they are who they are, and that the internal factors in the beginning phases of treatment are more important than if there was a reality surrounding it. Okay. And that even goes to, for example, individuals such as those who are forced to do treatment. If their internal reality is that they're there because the judge put them there, or they had a crappy attorney or something like that, we have to realize that that's their reality in this moment. And in the beginning, we're going to challenge these things later on. In the beginning, we accept that that is who they are, okay? And that's their reality, okay? So, so again, going on the centered focus approach, these are kind of the 6 things of what clients need to feel and helpers need to feel. The client and helper must be in what we call a psychological contract, okay? Now, we have the formal contract when they come in, and it gives them their rights to privacy, what they should expect in treatment, and all of those kinds of things. And that is an important aspect of the treatment process. But we also need to be in a psychological contract, that they feel like you are actually there and present, and that they will be there and present as well. And you create this relationship with each other, okay? And it goes into the second one, which says that the client must be in a state of congruency, okay? The way these 2 things are achieved, it looks like I need to use a different color pen. These 2 things are achieved, especially from a helper's perspective, is that we have to be there in each and every session, okay? When I used to do treatment, I used to sit outside, well, if it was a group one or an individual one, I used to sit outside the treatment room, even if it was my office. And I would sit there and I would think about all the troubles I had that day. Maybe I was late to work, or I have a bill due, or maybe I have an argument with my spouse, or my kids are having issues. And I would think of all of those things, and I would physically represent taking them out of my head and setting them next to the door and telling them that I will be back in an hour. And then I went into the room so that I could be there completely and presently for that client, and that my issues were not going to be on my mind as I'm trying to create this congruency with my client. And this goes to number 3, the helper must be congruent, genuine, or integrate in the relationship, okay? Now, this is where personal disclosure does come into play. And we'll talk about personal disclosure in much more detail later on. But there is sometimes an appropriate place for personal disclosure to clients. Create that genuineness between you and them, okay? But again, this is a skill that we'll need to develop over the course of the semester, because sometimes a therapist will do personal disclosure because they need to get something off their chest. It's an issue with them. Okay, I often see this in situations where a provider is working with someone who maybe had experienced molestation or something like that, or some type of abuse in past relationships. And maybe before that session, they were reminded of that and was reminded of all the awful things that happened to them. And when they're having this congruent relationship with the client, sometimes I've seen it where a helper will start processing their own issues from their own abuse and their own situation, thinking that it's going to help their client. Okay. This is where, when we get to personal disclosure, we're going to do what's called a self check. So this is, you're sitting there going, I feel like I should say this about my personal life. Maybe it will help. And you really, really sit and think about whether that's going to be beneficial or not. Okay. But regardless, that congruency needs to be genuine. Okay. The helper must show unconditional positive regard. Okay. And again, we talked about this when we talked about Roger's theory about you needing to completely and totally accept you for all your good qualities, all your bad qualities, and then only can you provide that to your client. Okay. And it comes down to this acceptance for who they are. We all will probably work with clients that we don't like very much. Maybe they tell about experiences that you just don't agree with whatsoever. Okay. But even in that situation where you have a personal angst about someone, you have to set that aside and try to accept them completely and totally for who they are, or or um, what was I going to say? Or we may need to say, especially if it's something that really affects you as the helper, maybe it's time for you then to transfer that client or that person to a different group with a different provider. This is a thing that you have to keep uh, lid on. This is something you need to control. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, I will tell you that for when I did supervision and stuff, and I had clients come in and say, I don't like this therapist, can you find me another one? Or I don't like this group, is there another group I can go to? It usually always came to this number 4 issue when I talk to the therapist or the social worker or the helper about why is it that client wants to change groups. It's because they didn't keep themselves checked. They didn't keep that unconditional positive regard, and therefore did rejecting behaviors, was not accepting of the client, was not all the things that that client needed in a therapeutic relationship. Okay. So again, you'll notice that yes, clients do have issues and can create havoc in groups, but I always want to take it back to the helper, because the only way to reduce problems within the treatment process is by us making sure that we keep in good check on ourselves. Yes, will there be situations where it is the client that runs it, but what we have to show as therapists or as helpers, that we did everything we could to provide that client with a genuine, client-centered, client-focused environment. Okay. Number 5, this may sound like unconditional positive regard, but this is but it's a little bit different in that the helper must experience empathy for the client. Okay, empathy versus concern or compassion. Okay, empathy is that you experience what your client is experiencing emotionally and psychologically, but it doesn't lead you to feel sorry for them. That's compassion. Compassion is when you feel sad for someone because of what they're experiencing. When we talk about empathy, it's being able to feel what the client is experiencing. So when they're saying something that is sad, you feel sadness. When they're saying something happy or positive, you feel that positivity. And what this does is it allows you again to integrate and become genuine and congruent in the relationship. Now, again, with everything, there's a dark side because there is actually a dark side of empathy. Okay. A lot of people in a lot of literature don't talk about it, but this is something we need to be aware of because there is a dark side of empathy. Okay. Is empathy in everyday life actually can prevent us from helping instead of integrating us and providing help. Okay. And maybe one of the best examples is you see a homeless person um, on the street, they're begging, maybe they're on the ground, they might be suffering in some way. And if you're highly empathetic, you are feeling their suffering. Okay. But unfortunately, for most people, your impulse is not to help that person. Your impulse is to escape that suffering yourself. So people who have high empathy, unless they learn how to use it, tend to not um, help. They tend to try and escape from the suffering or the pain that other people are feeling. Okay. So this is partly an experience we need to develop, being able to feel the feelings and the situations of our clients. But this is also, we have to learn tools and methods of then how do we use that feeling of empathy to help a client, to help another human being, because then we just want to escape from it. And again, when I go back to my supervision days, even with me sometimes, and I felt high empathy for a client or something like that, I just wanted to end that session, or my supervisees just wanted to end the session and they rush through everything just so that they can get out of that situation and stop feeling that pain that the client relayed to them. So it's something that is a skill that needs to develop so that you don't want to escape the situation, but you actually want to engage in helping behavior. Okay. And the last one is the client must experience the helper's congruency and unconditional positive regard and empathy. Okay. There's a thing that has mainly been talked about in sports. It's called a state of flow. Okay. A state of flow is when a batter is in this perfect relationship with the pitcher, and they're just in this congruency. It's when a football player is in this state where they know exactly where to run the ball and are in this zone of experience, or a swimmer. And what happens in that situation is everything in the world fades to the background, and it becomes just that athlete and that challenge that they're overcoming. Nothing else in the world exists. Okay. We know that this similarly happens when you and your client are in a state of psychological contract and congruency. That you get into a situation where the only thing that exists are you and that client, or in our situation, you and your group members. Everything in the room kind of fades and goes away. And it's just you and them, you're hearing them, you're feeling them, they're feeling, and you're in this state of flow. Okay. This is when you know you achieve number 6. Okay. And if you've ever been to a therapist who is what we call a master's therapist, it means that they've been in the field for 30 years. They've probably written several articles and books, and they're sought out for trainings and for treatment. Okay. One of the strange things that people will notice about them is they set timers. If they know that a session needs to end in 60 minutes because clients have a life, you have a life, and we got to make sure that we have these boundaries, they use timers because most of the time they get into a state of flow with their client. And in that state of flow, you also lose track of time. Okay. And so they use the timers because the timer will go off and kind of break that state so that you can then end your session and wrap up what you need to wrap up and complete the therapy session. Okay. Now, a lot of people go, well, what if you're in a complete state of flow and everything's going great? Again, one of the things that is part of the client provider relationship, the therapeutic alliance, is healthy boundaries. Okay. And so when you say our therapy session is going to last 60 minutes, ending in 60 minutes is actually a healthy thing. It's not an unhealthy thing. Because again, you're teaching and you're showing that you have boundaries, you respect them, and they need to respect you. And so a lot of times when I give this kind of talk, I get hands, well, what if they're really into, well, again, one of our jobs is being able to help our clients learn boundaries. So, all right, so that is the six that kind of is the relationship between us and our clients. And again, I'm going to state this, this is whether you're doing individual treatment or group treatment. These things matter. In the group setting, it is a little bit harder because you have to have this unconditional positive regard for 6 to 9 people, not just one, in a state of congruency with 6 to 9 people and not just one. So these are things that you kind of have to work with. Group treatment is often seen as easier. It's easier because you can do it with several people instead of one, but the job for the helper actually, or the facilitator actually increases because you have to then attend in that situation to several people and not just one. Okay. All right, so before I move on, does anybody have any questions about center-focused approach? It's also called client-centered approach. Um, uh, does anybody have any questions before we move on to a couple skills that I want everyone to start practicing? You could put them in the chat. Don't raise your hand. I don't have my view to see you guys on, but if you unmute yourself, you can unmute and say, hey, I have something, but I'll give you just a few seconds to think about any questions that you might have. All right, thank you, Alexandra. Yeah, Lucinda, we can do that, definitely. So, unconditional positive regard is when you have complete acceptance of yourself, that you know your good qualities, you know your bad qualities, you have a complete understanding of yourself, and you accept yourself completely, meaning there's not much difference between who you think you should be and who you are. Okay, so it's a state of one's self acceptance on your part. And then, based on humanistic theory, what that allows you to do is have complete acceptance of your client. You accept them for who they are, regardless of their situation, regardless of their negative qualities, regardless of any state that they're in. And in that unconditional positive regard, this then sets an environment where the client and you can have a state of congruency and honesty about the client's situation. Does that make more sense? Does that help? or should I try a different way to explain it? Okay, awesome. And thank you for asking that question. Again, in a class like this, we're kind of giving the more simple version, but I would encourage you to do more investigation into it and how to develop this skill. So, any other questions or comments?
Dr. Peterson?
Yes.
I have a question. When we are learning to develop this kind of skill, what would you say is a good, like how would someone tap into developing that skill? Because I feel like there's a lot more that would go into that in like the person's themselves to kind of find that within, but how would you explain developing that skill for the unconditional positive regard?
Grace, that is a wonderful question. I really appreciate you asking that because one of the things that we don't have the benefit in this undergraduate uh, uh, um, um, presentation on this kind of skill is that if you go on, and I'm just going to give this part, but then we can talk about how we can start to develop the skill. If you go on to a good master's program, and I'm saying good because there's a lot of bad ones. If you go into a good master's program, you'll actually spend the first year and a half not doing treatment on other people, but treatment on yourself. You'll put yourself through the complete treatment process facilitated by your professors and your instructors. Okay. And really, that is the only way to really develop the skill is imagining yourself as the client, as the person sitting in that chair and trying to express who you are as a human being and outlining your positive and negative qualities and looking at yourself from a truthful lens and challenging yourself on that. Okay. I'll be honest with you, this is not a skill that I think most people can fully develop. Okay. Because there's always going to be parts of us that we want to deny or we just don't accept for ourselves and those kinds of things. But if we can get to a point where we have an understanding of who we are, and even if there's areas that we can that we want to avoid or deny, at least our awareness of that can help us provide this professionally. So really in developing the skill, it's really putting yourself kind of like you are the client in a treatment setting and what questions and being honest with yourself about if you were talking about something, what would you honestly want to ask as a therapist to know more and or to dig deeper? Does that make sense on that on the individual end?
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of like what I was thinking as you were explaining it, but I was just like, it really, I guess for me, it felt like that would definitely be something really personal that someone would have to go through to be able to do that. And so I just wanted to make sure, like, is that the right way or not that there is going to be a right or wrong way because it really is going to be digging deep within. But it makes sense. It like confirms what I was thinking exactly.
Great, great. I'm glad. The other way to also start to develop these skills, including positive regard, is also in our daily interactions with others. And this is probably a good segue into the two major skill. There's three. The two major skills that anyone in this field needs to have. When we really dig down, not very many people actually have it. Okay. And that is learning to attend and listen to what people are actually saying. I think I said in the beginning of class that most people listen and attend to respond. Okay. So what I want to kind of talk about going on more on the skill development end and kind of what Grace was asking about personal development is not is I'm going to kind of talk about this in a dual way because of Grace's question, is learning how to attend to your clients and to yourself is an important skill to achieve. Okay. When we look at the kind of the basics of attending, this is orienting ourselves physically towards our client to start to develop a physical relationship. So on the attending part, it's us being there physically, okay? Us being there in a thoughtful way, okay? If I go back to Grace's example, when you're really attending to what you're thinking about and what you're feeling, you really should do it not while you're driving your car or watching TV, or no, you should do it kind of where you would in a therapeutic setting, in a comfortable chair where you're relaxed and you're in place and you can truly think about what you're going through without any distractions. Okay, so that's on the personal reflection end. But let's look at attending from kind of a therapeutic relationship uh, part. Okay, so I have always liked this. Uh, um, this encourages acronym, but with each of these, there always needs to be a caveat. Okay. Um, and so I first want to, I'm actually going to start down here, spacing appropriately. I'm going to start with the S. Okay. One of the things that I would encourage you to do, whether it's individual or it's group settings, is to allow the client to choose the space they want to interact with you in. Okay. So, for example, in a group room, I used to, especially for the first couple sessions, would have all the seats stacked up. And then as group members came in, I would ask them then to take the chairs and form a circle or something like that. So that they made the choice of where they felt they would be comfortable in distance with each other and within distance of me. Sometimes they would do a very close knit circle. Sometimes they would kind of be a distant circle from each other. But allowing that space of comfort is important. When I used to do individual therapies, I used to have my office set up to where they could either sit by my desk, so there was a physical boundary between us, or I would have a chair where they would be right in front of me, or I'd have another set of chair where we'd be more kind of at like a 45-degree angle with each other. So it provided different levels of comfort for the client to choose the space. And usually what I would do is I would go get my clients and I'd bring them back and I would open the door for them and say, please sit wherever you feel comfortable. Okay. And that's a good way to kind of do the space appropriately. But it also allows you kind of as the helper to determine the progression of your relationship with a client. Because, for example, I had several times I had people want to sit at the desk where that's that boundary. But then if we were doing things right, eventually maybe it would head over to the 45-degree angling seat, or then maybe eventually to the ones where we were facing each other. Okay. In the group setting, sometimes I had groups that they spread way apart in the beginning, but over the course of the treatment groups, they would come closer and closer and closer. So this is a good way to, one, allow the client to feel comfortable in that situation and comfortable physically, but also it also is an opportunity for you to gauge where they are in the comfort level of your therapeutic alliance. Okay. Okay, so now let's go back up here. So eye contact, head nods are all important. Okay. Um, there's a saying that the eyes are the windows to the mind, and there is some truth to that. That when we make eye contact, we make human connection. In fact, if you've ever had that kind of eye contact where it just felt good for a few seconds just to have that stare with someone, but then a lot of times, if you're like me, you get embarrassed, so you shy away, and you get flushed. Okay, now a lot of times that might happen because you're seeking romantic endeavors, but that kind of feeling, what is happening when you make that connection, is that your brains, both of you are releasing oxytocin. Oxytocin is the bonding chemicals that bond individuals together. Okay. Um, and then the head nods, of course, so this just means that when you're there, you're physically indicating that you're listening. You nod your head or you use your hands to say, tell me more, tell me more. Okay. Now, because these two can be culturally bound, and so can some of these other ones, but definitely eye contact and physical gesturing. This is an important part of this is cultural differences. Okay. And this is one thing you need to make sure before you're going into an attending situation is the cultural boundaries of the situation. Um, in this class, several times I've had students raise their hands and say, well, in my Native American community, it's women shouldn't make eye contact, or men won't make eye contact, or both won't until something is established or something is that. It's also true when we compare Eastern cultures with Western cultures. Western cultures, we think that there's something wrong with the relationship if we don't have eye contact. Whereas in a lot of the Eastern cultures, especially in Asia, Japan, China, it's actually seen as a sign of disrespect to maintain some type of eye contact. Okay. So while it is important to make some type of initial contact with them and have that moment of we're connected with each other, make sure you know the cultural expectations of what is appropriate in that kind of interaction. Um, I will say I had a lot of individuals who went through the pure Western treatment training, and they come into situations and they get frustrated because their clients wouldn't maintain eye contact with them, and they thought that they were doing something wrong. And a lot of times those clients wouldn't come back. Okay. It is important because most of this time where this happened is that there was a cultural difference. The therapist wasn't necessarily doing anything wrong other than trying to force the eye contact, and the client wasn't doing anything wrong by doing what they've been taught and learned and emotionally prepared for based on their cultural expectations. So do keep in mind that there is cultural variability um, um, in that. And so, Lucinda, I hope that helps with that question about making sure we're culturally competent when we get into this. Okay. Open stance. Um, Open stance is that you show that you're there and you're vulnerable. Okay. When now there is times where it's appropriate to, for example, have your legs crossed, examples of wearing a skirt or something like that. There's always some socially appropriate reason why you have a more enclosed stance to you, and we need to keep those in mind. But when a human being, or even when we look at other species, that you don't have your arms crossed, you're not on your chair with your knees up and your stomach and everything else. We that gives a sense that you're closed off to the people that you're talking to, that you're not being open with them. Okay, so learning how to keep an open stance. Um, and being able to, when we get to this one, relax is an important skill. very early on in my uh, training and treatment, I had a habit of folding my arms while talking to clients or just talking to people in general. It was a very much a habit for me. It feels comfortable for to me, but learning through my supervision and learning through experience, it often made my clients feel really uncomfortable and didn't make them feel that I was actually there for them. And so for the first while, and I'll be honest, this is what I had to do, is I would kind of sit kind of a little bit forward and I would sit on my hands in order to resist the the habit of folding my arms. And I had to do that for a good amount of time before I got to the point where I could just have my hands down by my side. Okay. But this requires us to check our habits and making sure that when we're with a client, we present ourselves as vulnerable and open to them as we want them to be for us. Okay. Check for understanding. Okay. So this is something that we'll talk about a lot when we get into the listening skills. Okay. Is check for understanding. And what I would like you to start practicing, and we'll get into this when we get in mainly into the listening skill, is when you're attending and listening to someone and you're doing the nodding, the appropriate eye contact, you're doing everything good. What I would like you to practice doing is when there's a natural break in the conversation, state something like this. So, what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, and then you repeat what you heard, okay? But there's two components to this that are important. One, what I hear you saying, you're saying, this is what I heard from you. So you're putting a mirror up to them so that they can actually hear what they just stated. And then you're creating the opportunity for them to empower themselves by saying, but correct me if I'm wrong. You're giving them the power to say, no, that's not what I meant, or no, I think there was a misunderstanding, or something like that. You're giving them the power in the relationship, which is important. You're empowering them. Okay. Now, I would encourage you to do this with people you know that you're starting to develop this skill because again, other classes and what's not, they come back and say, "Oh, my boyfriend thought I was being ridiculous," and blah blah blah. Because in the beginning, this doesn't sound natural. It sounds kind of like you're BSing them or doing something unnatural. But the more you practice this, the more it becomes part of your vernacular. And the way you say it sounds like you are honestly and truthfully and congruently asking this permission to see what I heard and for them to correct you if you said something that was deviant from what they meant or what they meant to say. So practice this skill. We'll go over it again when we get into listening skills, but practice it with individuals that know you're trying to develop this attending and listening skill to avoid any awkward situations. So try that and report back to me your experience, please. The next thing is relax. Now, in the relax, it doesn't mean you're kind of slouching down in the chair and you're kind of have a dozing off look and you look like you're on vacation. What we mean by relax is that you're not tense, that your arms are laying at your side naturally, and that you breathe. And then, because what you want to do, again, when we get to skills, one, if you're relaxed, when people are relaxed, we assume that they're actually attending more, okay? That they're listening better. And so you're relaying this unconscious message that I'm here, I'm not uptight, I'm here to listen. But also you start to develop a skill for your clients. So when things start to get tense and they start to tighten up, that's when you know that they're in a state of tension, and you can do a breathing technique, you can do a mindfulness technique to help them bring down their tension. But we don't notice when people get in a more tense mode if we ourselves are in a tense mode or experiencing tension. So making sure that you yourself are physically relaxed and you're there so that you recognize that your clients are becoming more and more tensed through the session, and you can kind of stop and go, hey, let's just for a minute, let's breathe, let's count, let's do 10 breaths or do something mindfulness and say, let's come back to the here and now for now. Let's focus on what you're experiencing right now. Okay. The other one, and this is again another skill that I had to definitely develop. I have a bad habit that when I have a pen, I do the clicky thing. I know a lot of people, they have that shaky leg thing. Some people like to tap on their desk. And we all have these kind of unconscious behaviors that help us relieve our own kind of anxiety or get us in a habitual mood. Okay. But we want to avoid and start practicing not having those distracting behaviors. I did this mainly when I did some case management work, because when you're doing case management, you're usually filling out forms and doing those kinds of things. So I had to get a pin that you didn't click. so I couldn't go with my thumb and start clicking the pin, and those types of things. So avoiding distracting behaviors. And this has really one thing, is that when a client starts to be asked questions that are uncomfortable for them, they'll start paying attention to the distracting behaviors in the room. They're looking for something else to focus on. Okay. We also should talk about avoiding distractions with your environmental setup. Okay. Your office should not be cluttered with a bunch of posters, bobbleheads. I think about the stereotypical social worker on TV with all the bobbleheads, all these cards, all this flashy colors, all of these different distractions in your office. I would encourage you to go to your office, especially if you see clients there, and walk in there and go, if someone was trying to tell me something that was very uncomfortable, what in here would they go to a distraction point in order to avoid that conversation? Okay. So when you go into, when you think about the space where you're going to do treatment, it's not advantageous to have all of these cutie pie posters everywhere and all these distracting objects and all of those kinds of things. You want to keep your office space or your treatment space to a minimal area to where they're focusing on the relationship between you and them. Okay. Grammatical style. All right. This is basically not using all the jargon that you learned in academia or in your trainings or in your organization when you're speaking to other professionals. Okay. This isn't where you get into a conversation where a person is having uncomfortable feelings in a relationship or what they're doing, and you go, well, what I think you're experiencing is cognitive dissonance, which is a disconnect between your beliefs and behaviors and what you're emotionally experiencing. No, we want to avoid that type of vernacular, because what starts to happen when you do that is that the client starts to feel like you're talking down to them and not with them. Okay. Now, of course, if you're doing treatment with educated individuals, they have their degree in psychology or sociology or social work, and you're providing treatment in that, yeah, so you could use those grammatical styles. But what we need to learn in attending is understanding where an individual is in their grammatical abilities and not their abilities or the way that they talk and understand the world. And in our head, we need to redefine, if we're trying to explain, for example, cognitive dissonance, we need to redefine it in the way that they'll understand it based on their grammatical style. So if, for example, if they're a storyteller, explaining things like cognitive dissonance or distress through storytelling instead of semantic explanation. Okay. So, but again, this is something again that is very tempting to do because we want to explain what we've learned that will help our clients, but always go back and make sure that you're matching what their understanding of their language, of their way of communicating is. Okay. And then the last one is ears. Okay. And this is, I mentioned this a couple times now in this class, is usually we listen to respond. Okay. So already, even though the information is coming through our ears, we're already processing it with the other parts of our brain to come up with our response to what they're saying. And the idea behind ears is that you totally absorb what someone is saying before you try and provide some type of solution to their problem. And this is another skill that I would encourage you to start practicing. So with your family members, your intimate partners, maybe friends, when you find yourself listening to them and you're already coming up before they're even done talking, and you're already coming up with what you're going to say, kind of force yourself to go, no, 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 no. Listen, ears. Remember ears right now, ears right now. And truly listen to what is being said before you then provide a response. And it's okay. We're going to talk about here in a few weeks about silence. Okay. And how important silence is. So listening to someone and then just providing a moment of silence while you collect your thoughts is actually a good thing. Okay. So kind of keep that in mind as we as a skill to kind of start practicing to develop. Okay. So listening, so this is now that second component, these two work together, is capturing and understanding the message that is being told to you. And this kind of goes to that unconditional positive regard that we started with, because this tends to be the most difficult skill for helpers to learn. Because we all come, and if you deny it, you have a lot more work than the rest of us do. We all come to a situation with our own personal biases, our own perceptions, and our own stereotypes about what is being said to us. Okay. And we will explore in this class our unconscious biases that we have and our perceptions and stereotypes that can interrupt our ability to truly listen to another human being. Okay. And one of the skills that I would like you to develop, I mentioned how outside the treatment room, I used to take my personal life stuff out of my head, and I actually physically represent it by pulling it out of my skull or out of my ear. One of the other skills that I would encourage you to develop is before you go into a treatment setting, you think about your biases, your perceptions, and your stereotypes about different people and put them outside the treatment room before you enter the treatment room, and physically keep that. the reason why I say that is they're going to follow you, but you'll be aware of them as you go through the listening process. And, some of the simplest examples of how this can interrupt is if you have clients who you have biases towards, maybe you have biases towards men, and you just think that they're well, actually, that's a good example for me. When I started in this field, I largely worked with women. In fact, 98% of my clients were women because it was within the domestic violence and sexual assault arena of human trauma. Okay. And literally 98%, meaning only 2 out of 100 people I saw, or 1 out of 50 people I saw, were men. And I struggled with that because I have sat and I've heard so many stories about men and their aggression towards women, and all of these stories accumulated in my mind that I had a huge human bias. I had a perceptual issue, and I had a huge stereotype about men and women and violence within a relationship. Okay. And I'll be completely honest with all of you. For the first while, when I realized this, I would have the agency actually switch the men to a different provider because I had a hard time overcoming that bias that I had. Okay. And it took me actually listening in more group settings and whatnot about the experience of men who experience violence within a relationship, and listening to them more closely and realizing I'm having these biases and stereotypes. I was usually had to start in the co-facilitator role in doing group treatment with men who had been victims of violence. And it took me, and to be honest with all of you, a few years to be able to work with men individually who had experienced violence within a relationship. Okay. And so, but this is what I mean, is being honest with yourself about your own perceptions about gender, race, age, economic status, and really understanding that we all have biases and perceptions that can interrupt the listening process. So this is step one to learning how to listen. Okay. And the other aspects of listening, and I've mentioned this time and time again, is unbiased listening. Responding before knowing is our natural reaction. Effectively reflecting on thoughts and emotions is one way to overcome this. So when, again, it goes back to that skill that we were talking about with encourages, is instead of giving an instant answer to someone when they've told you something and asked you a question, actually stopping and doing a reflection, such as, so what I heard you say is XYZ, and the question you have is this correct? Instead of just instantly answering the question. Okay. Again, this is that skill to develop. And I will say that research done, again, when I'm talking about master's level therapy training or education, many individuals who don't end up finishing their master's degree in counseling is because they can't master this skill. Because it is a skill that takes development. And if you say, well, I listen excellent, I'm going to encourage you to really explore that, because in my experience, the person that thinks they can listen the best naturally has the most learning to do, and really is not in the end the best listener. So I just want to encourage you, if you feel you naturally have this skill and you can just kind of skip it and move on to the other ones, this is the one that you probably need to work on the most. Okay, and I'm just being honest. Okay, so those are the basics. So these are the basic skills that we'll be developing. These are what we call the base. Attending and listening and doing reflection are the base 3 skills that all of the other skills that we will learn through this semester build upon. Okay. And I do want to say a lot, we've been talking more on an individual level, but these skills are especially true in the group setting. Okay. And I'll go back to the biases and whatnot. In a lot of situations in the group setting, I've seen this happen where the provider has a preference for a few group members and has less preferential feelings towards other group members. Not necessarily that they consciously do this, but it's more of an unconscious thing they do. So they allow certain group members to have, and the majority of the group, the majority of the talk, the more positive feedback, where other group members tend to be ignored more often. When they do say something, you just kind of say, oh, I appreciate for what you said, but hey, I'm more interested in what Bill is saying, or Bill, what do you think of this? And they provide that preferential treatment. So in the group setting, this is even a harder skill to develop, because a lot of times our unconscious biases can drive us to start making group member preferences, which then can bias the group process and not allow everyone to have that full engagement in the group process. But I just realized, everyone, we are at 11:15. So I'm going to stop sharing. We're over time. So if you need to leave, you need to leave. But I will ask, does anybody have any questions about the content that we covered today? You can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself. You can raise your hand, but I don't want to keep you much longer over class. So I'll give you just a couple seconds.
Is this being recorded so like we can go back and